ahead and get started, and people will just join as needed. So I just really want to thank you, Olga, for taking the time to meet us across the country and to present on your kind of area of expertise of emotions and conflict and everything else. So I will turn it over to you, and you can just let me know if you need anything at all during the presentation.
It might be good if we could create breakout rooms at the end.
Okay, I can definitely
have a practical exercise, and maybe, I mean, let's see how many people join up, but breakout rooms with about 5 people.
Okay, yeah, you just let me know when, and I will do that.
Great. Yeah. So it's nice to see you. Online is one option. I would have preferred to see you live, but that's how it goes. I think at least we have this opportunity to meet. Yeah, before I start, maybe a bit on what I do in my work and why I do it. So I'm a psychologist and neuroscientist by training. And my main expertise has been since 2007 in conducting longitudinal studies to look at brain plasticity in emotion, social behavior. And at some point in 2013, I had a discussion with a mediator, Jeremy Lack, who told me that there's actually very little evidence, empirical evidence on how to resolve conflicts. And that was when I decided to dedicate a lot of my work on that topic and to really investigate how interventions can causally impact conflict resolution. So that's where I'm coming from. I have been working at the University of Geneva for many years now, and I've recently transitioned to the University of Dresden in Germany. So that's where I am now. I'll share my screen. I'll just have to find my PowerPoint. Here it is. That's what I'd like to share. And I'll make it full screen. I think you can see it, right? Yeah, good. So what I'll be talking about is really the role of emotions in conflict resolution. And I like this picture of Banksy. He's one of my favorite artists when it comes to conflict art, so to speak. And it's really this idea that we want change. We just don't want anything else. We want to see real change in behavior, in emotions, and ideally also in the biological foundations of these things. So what are key assumptions that that I will cover in my talk? And these are also the structure of the talk. The first key assumption is that emotions play an important role in conflict and they motivate social behavior. And I will tell you a little bit about why. The second assumption, that's really the most important one for me, is that emotions and their related behaviors are malleable. So we can change them when we work on them. Now, the third one is I would like to work together with you on the implementation of these insights in your work. I would like to make this relevant to your work. Yeah, Emil? Okay. Kommst du mal kurz runter? I'll just have to take two seconds for my job. I'm sorry, I'll be back. Yeah. Okay, so you get a first-hand impression of triple tasking during the COVID crisis. Good. Okay, before we start, I'd like you to make this relevant for your own work. And so what I'd like you to take a few moments in the beginning is to really think of a conflict that you're currently working with and how the content, and while I will be talking, to really imagine how the content of my talk would apply to this particular conflict, and mainly its resolution, of course. I'll just give you a short moment to think of your favorite conflict of the moment. And then I'll start. And if you don't come up with any right now, I mean, maybe you will know during the talk which one's your favorite. So the first assumption that I'm coming in, or that I'm working in with, is that emotions play an important role in conflict and they motivate social behavior. This has been, for instance, stated by Daniel Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize in Economy in 2002. And he said in one of his books that high-stake problems are likely to involve powerful emotions and strong impulses to action. And I think you are all experts in that domain, and that there is no conflict without emotions, right? Because if we wouldn't be emotionally involved in something, we wouldn't engage in any conflictual behavior. And this is why emotions are so crucial to work with. When we look at the literature, at the empirical literature on how emotions relate to conflict and conflict resolution, I think Eran Halperin makes a nice distinction in his book, Emotions in Conflict, and we picked that up in a recent commentary that we wrote, is that one can differentiate between destructive emotions and constructive emotions, and some emotions that can be both constructive and destructive. So on the destructive side, we have hatred, fear, and Schadenfreude, or malicious joy. So hatred is when we think the other person is intrinsically bad and we dislike them and we wish them really bad things to happen. Fear is when, fear, I think everyone knows, is when we're afraid of something, can also motivate us to take destructive actions because we're so afraid. And malicious joy is also associated to rather destructive conflict behaviors. So when we are happy about the misfortunes of others. On the other hand, we know that if we incite hope, for instance, through articles or through messages in the media, or if people feel guilt, or potentially if they feel compassion, so there is now rising research, and I've recently summarized that, these emotions are conducive to resolving conflict, to reducing aggression, to increasing pro-social behavior, even in conflictual situations. And we also know that anger and empathy can go both ways. So we know that anger can be both a constructive emotion, but also a destructive emotion, depending on the situation, for instance. And empathy, likewise. Empathy tends to be more on the constructive side, but can sometimes also have some destructive components. I think this is an important slide because it shows us that there are certain emotions that we can try to foster, to promote in interventions to resolve conflict, like hope, guilt, compassion, to a degree also anger and empathy, and others that we can try to reduce, like hatred, fear, and malicious joy, in order to foster a resolution of a conflict that has maybe become entangled. Practical examples for how these emotions are used in political speeches, and I took a very recent example. We know that President-elect Biden, when he made his speech, said things like, "I pledge to be a president who seeks not to divide, but to unify. This is the time to heal America. It will be constructed out of compassion, empathy, and concern. We have the opportunity to defeat despair and to build a nation of prosperity and purpose. We can do it. I know we can." So to me, this message holds a lot of hope. It conveys a lot of compassion, empathy. And I think the actions or the intentions that follow from it are very different to another speech that we have recently maybe witnessed or that we are aware of, that has been given by President Trump on January 6th, which a part of it was, if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore. So this is a speech that contains fear, that provokes anger to a degree, and that is rather associated to destructive emotions. And as we know, certainly the second speech had a huge impact on social behavior, right? So I think we should be aware of the fact that emotions are very strongly linked to behaviors that we engage in. So my main expertise is in emotions, but also in different roots of social emotions. So how do we understand others on both on an emotional level, but also on a cognitive level? And here I would like to walk you through some key concepts that will be important later on in the talk when I talk about interventions and how some interventions work for certain groups and others don't. So empathy. Empathy is the capacity to share the emotions of others. So if someone is happy, I can share his happiness by feeling happy myself. If someone is sad, I can share their sadness by feeling sad myself. Then when it comes for empathy for suffering, we distinguish between empathic distress, which denotes a feeling of being overwhelmed by someone else's suffering. It's a negative emotion, it's self-centered. And on the other hand, we have compassion, which is a feeling of concern for the other suffering, which is more associated with positive emotions of warmth and care, and associated with the motivation to help the other person. On the other hand, we can also understand others through perspective taking, so a cognitive route to understand others' thoughts and intentions. So empathy, empathic distress, and compassion are more the emotional side, to understand emotions. And perspective taking, of course, we can also just cognitively understand the emotions of others, but it's mainly used to really infer thoughts and intentions. And we know that these aspects are differentially linked to pro-social behavior. And here I would like to illustrate this with some of my research that I've done in the recent years. So one thing is, in a study, I was interested in testing in how far the induction of empathy can causally increase pro-social behavior. And to this end, I used an economic game. It's like a dictator game. Dictator game is a game where participants get money, let's say $10, and they are asked to distribute the $10 they got between themselves and another person. And usually participants give a certain degree of a certain amount of that money to another person, even to an anonymous person. And economists have done thousands of studies, literally thousands of studies, investigating why this is the case. And they have overlooked that maybe empathy is a really good predictor of it. And indeed it is. So the study we conducted, we did it in students, but also in violent offenders. We showed that if we let participants play the standard game, so you just divide $10 between yourself and an anonymous person, participants give around 40% of the money to an anonymous person. This is in line with thousands of studies that have been done with that game before. However, if we have a task where we invoke empathy with films of people who are sad, who are crying, and we then ask people how much money do you want to give to that person, people give a lot more. They give about 70% of their points. So that's a lot. And this is converted to real money. And if we have situations where people are shown who are not in distress, who are not suffering, people tend to give a lot less than when they are suffering, but also less than to an anonymous person. So we basically could show that if you induce empathy, pro-social behavior goes up, which is in line also with what we see in everyday world when there are non-governmental organizations asking for funding and raising funding for projects. They also usually tend to show people who are suffering, and this incites then more donation. What's interesting to me is that the mean points that were allocated for the empathy-inducing videos are actually linearly predicted by the degree of empathy that people felt. So the more empathy they felt towards a person, the more points of money they gave to that person. So it was a really strong prediction, much stronger than the usual variables that economists looked at, like fairness or other norms, norm-related behavior. So emotions seem to be much stronger than these norms. Then in a different study, I was also interested in the relation between compassion, perspective taking, brain activations, and punishment behavior. So in that study, I had participants play also an economic game with two other players, and one of these other players would behave in a fair way and be nice to the participant, and the other player would behave in an unfair way and be nasty to the participant. And we did two studies on that topic. One just behavioral study with 40 participants, and one study where we scanned brain activations, actually. What we found is that compassion, so the more compassion participants felt in their everyday life, and the more they, the less they punished the other, the unfair other. So the less they engaged in a kind of antisocial behavior. And the more perspective taking they had in their everyday life, the less they also punished the unfair other, which was great. So the more forgiveness behavior we had. Interestingly, while they were being provoked by the unfair other, the more they had a signal in a region called dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is about here, the more activation they had in that region, I'll just admit a few more people, the less or the more they inhibited their aggression, which is also great. So it's like a biological marker of perspective taking and also cognitive control, emotional control. Good. So in summary, if we sum these slides up, we know that empathy is related to more altruism, to less aggression, less punishment. We know that empathic distress is related to withdrawal, or people may help to alleviate their own suffering. I didn't cover that in much detail, but you have to believe me on that. What I find interesting here is that compassion is really strongly related to altruism, reduced punishment. And there have also been studies showing that people who are more compassionate tend to forgive more, even in post-conflict settings like Northern Ireland. And further down in my talk, I will also talk about the relation between compassion training, actually, and the reduction of implicit biases towards outgroups. This is something I find really important. And we also know that in terms of perspective taking, it is associated with more altruism and less punishment, but not always. Perspective taking is a double-sided sword, and some people can also use it in order to their advantage and in order to harm others. So, second part, emotions and their related behaviors are malleable. And I find this really important because for a long time, I think there has been the assumption, especially in psychology, that things are the way they are, people have a certain personality, and And I think recently, in the at least recent, let's say 15, 20 years, there is more and more of that notion that we can change things and we can even change personalities and we can change behaviors through interventions. And these interventions can be short or long, but we do have the possibility to change. We do have the possibility to change emotions. We have the possibility to change biological functions, and we have the possibility to change social behaviors. And I think that's really crucial to our society. So what I'll talk you through is recent research of mine on the causal impact of stress, future thinking, mediation, training humanitarian values, meditation, and empathy and perspective under different conditions. So in one study, we were interested to know what's actually the impact of stress on punishment, because we know that in everyday life, we tend to be stressed a lot, or some of us tend to be stressed a lot, workload, etc. And the intuition is that maybe the more stressed we are, the more we might become aggressive, but we really wanted to test this in a causal way. So what we did is we invited participants to come to the lab, and we divided them into two groups. One group was the stress group and one group was the non-stress group. We had them fill in a range of questionnaires, also about their stress, pain, and unpleasantness feelings. IRE is an empathy questionnaire, PANAS is positive and negative emotions. And the stress group underwent what is called the SECPT, is a very long word, so socially evaluated cold pressor task. So what this means is participants have their hand immersed in ice cold water for a maximum of 3 minutes. We tell them that to keep the hand in the water for as long as they can, but after 3 minutes, we tell them to stop so that they don't suffer any damage. And they are being filmed. And we tell them that this video recording will be later on evaluated. And we have a stern-looking experimenter standing next to the camera, looking at them in an unfriendly way. The control group immerses their hand into lukewarm water. They have no camera they have to look at, no video recording, no experimenter looking at them. After they do that, participants rate again their stress, pain, and unpleasantness. And then they play the game that I've been talking about before, where they interact with one fair player and one unfair player, and we measure their behavioral response to the fair and unfair players, so as a measure of punishment. And then while we did all this, we also took some saliva samples from participants to measure their cortisol levels in order to have a biological marker of stress. That was the game. In brief, it's many economic interactions, and participants choose, and they can choose much more or less money and send nice or nasty feedback messages. So what does it do? The stressor. So in red, we have the stress group. In blue, we have the control group. And we see that the stress group increases their cortisol in the saliva. So the stressor works in that it does increase the cortisol secretion compared to the control group, where we see that the cortisol levels go down over time. And we also see an impact on behavior. So in the control group, we see that the more positive the behavior is, the more cooperative people are. So they are cooperative towards a fair player and tend to be rather cooperative towards the unfair player. In the stress group, however, they tend to be cooperative towards the fair player, but they are competitive, or they show punishment behavior towards the unfair player, which negative means they are not nice to this person, right? And this is significantly different from the fair player, but also importantly, significantly different from the control group. And what we see as well, and what I find interesting, is that the more cortisol people have, the less they are cooperative. So the more they punish, the more cortisol they have, the more that they punish. So it seems that the biological stress response is linearly related to the behavioral punishment that participants show. Another thing that we investigated, so that was more on the dark side, right? How does the stressor impact social behavior? And I think what we can learn from the stress study is that it's good if we have a negotiation to reduce stress as much as we can, to reduce it beforehand, to reduce it during the negotiation, to try and have people in an as much calm and non-stress state as possible. Another intervention that we were interested in is future thinking. So there is this famous situation where Carter was doing a future thinking induction, telling people to think about their grandchildren. And this helped in the negotiation at Camp David. And we were interested in whether this is an effect that we can replicate in the lab. And what did we do? We had a game that measures pro-social behavior. So this is a game where participants navigate through a maze, and they hunt for treasures, and at the same time someone else is navigating through a different maze. But participants can actually use their keys to open doors that block another participant. So we don't introduce this game as a pro-socialness game, but we introduce it as a game where they have to be fast and get their treasures because it's about points. But what we measure implicitly and what's actually of interest to us is the pro-social behavior participants do display. And we divided participants, so we had 48 participants in total, and we divided them into two groups, and we asked one group to think about future events for 1 minute, just to think what could happen to them in the future, at least 30 days ahead, so in over 1 month, and to just name these events, just to list them. And another group was asked to list animals for 1 minute. It was a really brief instruction. And what we found, and that's really amazing to me, is that the future thinking group showed more helping behaviors than the control group. And this is extremely encouraging for me because it shows that a very brief intervention, just thinking about the future for 1 minute, that does make a difference in pro-social behavior. It does boost pro-social behavior. Okay. The impact of mediation on couple conflict. So this picture here is of François Bogart. He's a mediator and a PhD student of mine. And he was interested in showing the causal influence of mediation. And in order to find a conflict that's real and that can be used in the lab setting, we decided to use couple conflict because it's relatively easy to actually evoke a couple conflict in the laboratory. So we invited couples who have been together for at least 1 year. And we asked them to discuss their favorite topic of disagreement in the lab. and it works marvelously. So the couples get started and they forget that they are being videotaped and measured and whatnot. And we tested these couples with or without a mediator. So we had 19 heterosexual couples with a mediator and 19 heterosexual couples who did their conflict discussion. As usual, we had a silent person who's a mediator sitting in the room. And in one case, this mediator actually had to intervene because the conflict got too heated. But otherwise, the mediator remained silent. So what we found overall in that study is that the more emotional competence couple members had, the higher what their relationship quality was. And we also found that couples who had, or couple members who had more mindfulness, had also more active constructive behaviors like perspective taking in a conflict, and more passive constructive behaviors like delayed responding. So taking a break before actually responding in maybe the wrong way. So taking a moment to sort one's thoughts and then respond. So what we found is maybe not surprising to you, but it was encouraging to us because it was the first study showing this, that mediation does indeed improve conflict resolution in romantic couples compared to a normal negotiation or discussion. So there were more agreements in the mediated condition than in the control condition. And actually the odds ratio for reaching an agreement was 1.4 times higher in the mediated group compared to the non-mediated group. We also found trends for an impact on affective state. So there was higher positive effect and lower negative effect in the mediated group compared to the non-mediated group. And we also had, and this was significant, we had more satisfaction about the contents of the discussion and about the process of the discussion in the mediated compared to the non-mediated. It was very encouraging, but we wanted more. And we were interested in how mediation actually not only impacts self-reports of the couples, but actually their brain activations when they see their romantic partners. So does it also change a neural signature that one cannot just voluntarily change? So we repeated the experiment with different heterosexual couples. So we had 18 heterosexual couples per condition in this experiment, either with a mediator or without a mediator. And couples first did questionnaires, then they did an fMRI task, then a conflict discussion, then again questionnaires, fMRI task. And one couple member always did the fMRI task, and the other one did the decision-making task because we only had one scanner, so we had to scan either the man or the woman in each couple. What the couple did when their brain activation was measured is they saw pictures of their romantic partner, either neutral or smiling and in different angles, or of an unknown person. And they also had to rate how much they right now like their romantic partner or not. And they also had to do a countback task. That's something we need for fMRI measures to get a good baseline. So what's the brain activity related to the romantic partner? So we did an analysis that's called region of interest analysis. So we used regions that were previously found to be related to the representation of romantic partners in other research. And these are the ventral tegmental area, the nucleus accumbens, and caudate. And yeah, so we use these areas. Most important area is the nucleus accumbens. And we find that nucleus accumbens activation in our experiment was higher before the conflict for the smiling romantic partner compared to a smiling unknown person. And the nucleus accumbens is known as a region important for reward processing. So really, it's activated when we see our romantic partner, but also when we see our smiling baby, when we taste food that we like, or when we have other pleasurable experiences. Overall, pre-conflict activations for romantic partners include many more regions. When we looked at the whole brain, it included the orbital frontal cortex, also known to be important for positive emotions, but also for integrating emotions and behavior. The putamen, which is shown here, also an important region for emotions. Occipital lobes are important for visual processing. Precuneus also important for integrating action and decision-making. Temporal lobes important for perspective taking, interestingly, all these activations were reduced post-conflict in both groups. So we have seen that the post-conflict activations are lower in all these regions that have been associated to romantic. But the interesting thing is now the comparison between the mediated and the non-mediated group. On the behavioral level, we find again that the number of agreements is much higher in the mediated group than in the non-mediated group, right? That we have more satisfaction in the mediated group about the content and the process. And we also, and that's to us the most interesting finding, is we also have a trend for higher activations in the nucleus accumbens. So this region important for reward, when the mediated group saw their romantic smiling partner versus an unknown smiling person after the conflict. And this activation in the nucleus accumbens also correlated with higher satisfaction about the process and the content of the discussion. So we now have a neural marker that is related to satisfaction and to better conflict outcomes and to reward in the nucleus accumbens. And we have shown that mediation actually helps to preserve these activations in the nucleus accumbens compared to a normal disagreement. Okay, so that's for that. So mediation seems to work, which is good news for all of you who work with mediation. There was another thing we were interested in, and that was a longer training. So you may remember the future thinking was just 1 minute, then the mediation was actually 1 hour, I didn't tell you, in both studies. And then we wanted more, so we tested the impact of a 5-day training of humanitarian values and how it changes the group relations. So this was something done in collaboration with the Swiss Ministry of Foreign Affairs, with the Society of the Red Cross and the Red Crescent, and Save the Children. And people working on this were Koa and Emna in my team. And we actually conducted this study in different countries, in Russia, in Belarus, Armenia, and in Gambia. And we had a total of 99 participants who were teenagers or young adults. So the age range was from 13 to 29 years. And we investigated intergroup dynamics. So we wanted to know whether training humanitarian values actually improves pro-social behavior towards outgroups who are from migrant communities. So what did we do? So before and after the 5-day humanitarian value training, participants read different short stories, and then we measured their emotions and behaviors. And then they did the 5-day training, and then they read again stories, and we measured their emotions and behaviors. And the stories were more or less like this one. So next week, Belarus, and this is, for instance, a boy from the outgroup, will be visiting us here, although it was forbidden. He has climbed a tree with friends last week and has fallen down. Now Belarus has a fractured arm and is wearing a plaster. As a result, Belarus has difficulties when writing and needs help. And then after these short stories that were similar, we asked participants about their emotions. So for instance, in terms of compassion, how sympathetic they feel, in terms of distress, how worried they felt, and in terms of malicious joy, whether they actually had to laugh about the misfortune of the other. Most importantly, we asked them about their willingness to help. So imagine you have a free afternoon. Would you be willing to help Belarus? And if yes, for how long? So then participants indicated to us in minutes how long they would be willing to help this person from the in-group or from the out-group. So what we saw is that training humanitarian values improves the willingness to help out-group members through an increase in feelings of distress and compassion. So what we see here is a change in compassion towards the out-group. In blue, we have the control group who has not trained, so they just had 5 days to do the measurement, and the training group in red. And this here is a willingness to help. So we see that the more the compassion towards out-group members increased through the training, the more participants were willing to help out-group members. And the more their feeling of distress increased towards the out-group members, the more they were again willing to help the out-group members. So it seems that if you train humanitarian values, it's really important to reach the emotional state of the target. So really to touch them, to increase their compassion, or even to increase their distress for others. who are suffering. And thereby, this seems to be the route through which helping behaviors, even towards outgroup members, can be increased. Meditation, that's something I've been working with for a long time, mainly in the domain of health and also Alzheimer prevention and other things, but also in the conflict domain. So there are two meditation techniques that play a crucial role for me. One is mindfulness meditation, which is defined as paying attention to moment experiences, like feelings, thoughts, sensory experiences, actions, motivations, in a non-judgmental way. And then we have compassion, which is cultivating feelings of benevolence and kindness for oneself and for others. So in my work, I tend to work with both, but I'd like to explain to you what we do when we talk about mindfulness or compassion. So mindfulness is basically one sitting there with eyes closed, still, and really trying to pay attention to whatever comes up in a non-judgmental way. So if there's a sound, we pay attention to the sound. If there's a thought occurring, we say, oh yeah, there's a thought. There's a feeling, we pay attention to the feeling, then it passes, and then we tend to pay attention to things that are just coming up. Compassion meditation or loving kindness meditation is different in that here we try to cultivate in a really structured way feelings of benevolence and kindness for ourselves and others. I'd like to show you how this is working. So it's working with a series of people that we are imagining, like a benefactor and other people. And while we are imagining each of these persons, we are cultivating a certain set of emotions. So benefactor, I tend to take my grandmother, for instance. I think of my grandmother and I internally, so I visualize my grandmother, and internally I can say sentences like, may you be happy, may you be healthy, may you be safe. And so there are three parts to that. The visualization of my grandmother as if she was sitting opposite me, for instance. The sentences, may you be happy, may you be healthy, may you be safe. And most importantly, the feeling that I have, the feeling of warmth, of care, of love. Then we pass on to the next person's self, which tends to be not always an easy person, especially in the West. And I can tell you from my own experiences, I've been through that. So we think of ourselves and we try to wish ourselves well. May I be happy, may I be healthy, may I be safe. And we pay attention to our feelings. We think of a friend, we do the same exercise. We think of a neutral person, like for instance, the person in a coffee shop that we may miss now because of COVID. We haven't seen her in a long time. We think of a difficult person. This is one of my favorite exercises because so far I managed to get rid of my difficult people through exercising with them, just mentally. And then finally, we think of all beings, right? So we think, may all beings be happy and healthy and safe. And this exercise can be done in 10 minutes. It can be done in 3 days, 3 weeks. Some people do it for 6 years. What I've done in several studies is to train this. And I've done different trainings with it. So I'll try to so either I've trained people only in compassion, or the control group did a cognitive training in memory, or I've trained them first in empathy. So first really empathize with the suffering of others, and then in compassion, like I just told you. And I measured them before the training, after the training, and if they did 2 trainings also after the second training. What I measured them with is the socio-affective video task. So they were basically confronted with the suffering of others, and I asked them how much empathy, negative emotions, and positive emotions they felt towards these people while I measured their brain activity. So when we think back to the different routes to understanding others that I introduced in the beginning, I saw in my studies that empathic distress or empathy for suffering actually increases negative emotions. People felt more negative when they were confronted with the suffering of others. And it increased activations in 2 brain regions, anterior insula, which is about here, and anterior cingulate cortex, which is about there. And these 2 brain regions are crucial for empathy for suffering. So basically, this exercise increased the brain regions active when we empathize with the suffering of others, but also when we suffer ourselves. Compassion training, however, done alone or done after the empathy training, increased positive emotions, increased also helping behaviors in another task, and increased brain activations in the striatum. That's actually the nucleus accumbens that we saw in the study of Halima with the mediators, and the orbitofrontal cortex, so both regions associated with positive emotions. So we know from these studies that we can train positive emotions, we can train emotions that promote pro-social behaviors, and we can change related brain functions in a very short time span. So the trainings we talk about here are roughly 1 week. So this is the pro-social behavior study. So we again had this task, that was when we developed it. And we saw that compassion training, but not memory training, increased helping behavior. And we also saw, so this is the graph, basically compassion training, pre-training, post-training, we see it's higher, and the memory group didn't change significantly. And what's most interesting to me is that the more participants practiced, the more their altruistic behavior actually increased. So that it's a dose-dependent effect. The practice really does make a difference on the process. More practice, more pro-social behavior. So there are now a couple of years, 10 years roughly later than we did the study, and now meta-analyses on showing that meditation actually does change social behavior. Meditation training increases pro-social behavior, and there's some evidence now that meditation training can decrease antisocial behavior. Just a second. Emil? Alles okay? Soll ich kommen? Oh yeah. I just have to go for just a second. Good. Okay. The impact of meditation training on conflict. So I recently summarized the work that's out there showing that meditation training can be beneficial in interpersonal and intergroup relations. And mainly we know that compassion is the important ingredient when it comes to promoting good interpersonal and good intergroup relations. Examples are the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, where it was shown that 8 weeks of mindfulness meditation compared to weightless control group decreased the feelings of threat and increased the readiness for political compromise. I think that's quite something. There's another study that I found really amazing, and this study has shown that 6 weeks of compassion training compared to an active control group and compared to a weightless control group reduced the implicit bias against Black people in the USA. So another important piece of evidence that compassion training really does make a difference. We were now interested in my lab with Patricia, who's a doctoral student, in using compassion training as an indirect way to improve conflictual relations. So to train compassion, but to measure its impact on conflictual relations, but not to use the conflictual relation in the compassion training in any way. So what we did, we invited 108 healthy adults, and we divided them into 3 groups: compassion training group, emotion regulation group, or Italian group. So they did each of these trainings for 5 weeks. And we tested them before the training and after the training with misfortune scenarios. And before the study, we asked participants to identify a difficult person. And we also asked some of the participants who that difficult person actually was. And in some of the cases, so a quarter of the cases, it was friendship, a formal friendship. In some cases, it was a formal relationship. In some cases, it was family, neighbors, other people, or work-related people. And what we found is that compassion training, so these 5 weeks of compassion training, increased interpersonal closeness in conflictual relations, but it also reduced Schadenfreude. So we found, so here we have Italian training, no change in Schadenfreude. This is before and this is after, and this is the degree of Schadenfreude. So no effect of Italian training, language training, but a decrease for the compassion training group, and also a decrease for the reappraisal or emotion regulation group. So if participants train for 5 weeks to regulate their emotions, it also decreases malicious joy when reading a misfortune scenario happening to a difficult person, and when imagining that. Most importantly, compassion training was specific in increasing feeling of closeness with that difficult person. And that was the only training that managed to increase feelings of closeness, which is quite amazing for us, because one tends to think that if a person is difficult, maybe they stay difficult for us, but it's possible to change that. And I think you and your professions, you know it, but I think it's an important message to the world that we can change people that are difficult with others, and we can make these people closer to our hearts. So I guess that's an important message. What I think is also important in general is to take into account the target characteristics. So when we think about compassion in general, we know that there's something that psychologists call an identifiable victim effect. So we know that usually a single individual elicits more helping behaviors than multiple individuals in need. So when we read articles, I think this is something that's being done everywhere now. Cases are usually illustrated with single person cases, right? So there's no like, oh yeah, and 50 people were hurt in that hurricane, but there are stories of individuals to illustrate this. So 50 people were hurt in that hurricane, but here's, for instance, a story of, let's say, Amanda and her family. And so we then can identify more with that person, and this elicits more helping. There's also the reverse side of it, compassion fades. So the more we have multiple victims who don't belong to a certain family but are unrelated, the less we have compassion for these people, the less we have helping behaviors. And we also know from social psychology, there tends to be an intergroup empathy bias. So we tend to feel more empathy towards members of our own group and less empathy towards members of other groups. I think what is also important and interesting is that there are different things that play a role when thinking about interventions in high conflicts that are really intractable, or phases of conflict. And this study here showed that in a phase of high conflict, an empathy induction, so this empathy induction consisted of reading an empathy expressing speech from a Palestinian leader, so Israelis read that speech. It reduced the willingness for reconciliation, but only in those Jewish Israelis who were low in trust. So if these people were low in trust and that it was a phase of high conflict, reading an empathy expressing speech from the out-group actually reduced the willingness for reconciliation. So we have to take multiple things into account when designing interventions. And I think this is something that's becoming more and more important to me, to actually map out under which conditions, which interventions work in which way. Because we know in general, some interventions tend to work and some interventions tend not to work. But I think the devil is in the details, and so is the recipe for success. And there's been one study that I conducted recently in Geneva, where I tested the impact of empathy and perspective-taking instructions in proponents and opponents of immigration. So immigration is a really hotly debated topic in most societies, I would say. And also in Switzerland, of course. And so what I did there is I invited one pro-immigration and one anti-immigration participant to the lab, a total of 92 participants. And participants did not know that this was how they were selected, right? But they were always paired, so one pro and one anti-immigration participant. And they should debate on 10 political topics, such as based on what criteria should immigrants be accepted to Switzerland. And they did so under 3 different instructions. So either perspective taking, try to take the perspective of the other, or empathy, try to empathize with the other, or control, no instruction. And I was interested to see whether participants were motivated to actually engage in these instructions, and also to test whether these instructions changed their emotions, but also their perception of the competitiveness of this interaction. And what I find interesting is that empathy and perspective taking instructions have very different effects on proponents of immigration and on opponents of immigration, right? So people who are pro-immigration here in dark gray, when they had the empathy instruction, they really were motivated to feel more empathy. And more so than participants in the anti-immigration group, who were not more motivated to feel empathy under any instruction. The instructions did not have an effect on them. The instructions only had an effect on the pro-immigration participants. Same for emotional awareness, which is related to empathy. Only the pro-immigration participants were motivated to pay attention to their own emotions, which is a part of empathy, to actually resonate with the other's feelings. Again, no change in the anti-immigration group. And same for perspective taking. Only the pro-immigration participants under perspective taking had more motivation to engage in perspective taking. No effect of the instructions on the anti-immigration participants. When it came to describing how competitive they perceived the debate to be, there was actually an effect on the anti-immigration participants in that when they were under the perspective taking condition, they perceived the debate to be more competitive. So to me, it means that the perspective taking instruction actually backfired, right? So interesting results. And to me, what it means is to take political orientation into account when designing interventions, and being aware that people with a different political orientation, with a different background, with high trust, low trust, phase of conflict, might react completely differently to interventions. Summary, so this is actually the final summary. The stress increases later punishment, we know that. And conflict resolution can be promoted through thinking about the future, but also through mediation, through training humanitarian values, through meditation. But it's important to pay attention to things like political orientation, levels of trust, phase of conflict, and potentially a myriad of other things that we still have to investigate in more depth when designing and when implementing interventions to resolve conflicts. Okay. Now, I'd like to pass to the implementation of these insights into your work. And ideally, if we can, what I'd like to do is to have small groups. I don't know how many people we are on the call. I'll try to get an idea.
I can get it to about 6 in 5 groups. There can be about 5 to 6 people per room.
Okay, yeah, that would be good. And what I'd like you to reflect on is, based on what I've shared, is what would you like to stop doing in your work? Where would you might slow down and be more careful and explore more what the effects are? And what would you like to start doing? So my idea would be to really group you, and you could, with the example you have come up with in the beginning of the talk, you could really discuss on how this talk inspires you to maybe stop things, slow down on things, and observe them more, and maybe start implementing new ways, new directions in your work. And before we go to that exercise, I'd like to thank mainly the wonderful team I've been working with for many years now, for their inspiration and for the pleasure it has been to work with them, and for many of the funding agencies that made this work possible in the first place. So I'll stop to share my screen. You have the slides. And yeah, we go into breakout rooms now, right?
I open the room.
And let's set a time. Let's say 10 minutes. Is that good? 10 minutes? I'll have a quick check on my son and I'll be back.
No worries.
Hello. Lynn, how are you? Good, how are you? I'm coming off, I think I'm on this in 2 places. Hi, Trudy, how are you? Oh, Anyway, this is fascinating.
If you
I
guys
missed
wanna
the very beginning because I wasn't, so I don't know what she asked us to think about. Maybe you guys can enlighten me. Oh, yeah. Right. Well, that's why I couldn't, I'm trying to be on my computer, but I ended up getting onto my phone. So the poor people in room 4 aren't going to get me. No worries. So, oh, so she said, oh, let me go look at my screenshot. The instructions, I think, were, how can we apply this? Let me see. What will you stop doing? Where might you slow down? And what will you start doing? Trudy, were you on the beginning? Do you know what she asked us to think about? I missed that whole piece. Okay.
Lauren, I've tried to move you to another room so you could get the notification to join again, but I don't know if you're seeing it.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, no, I agree. And yeah, and go ahead. Absolutely. I find so much of this is like, well, we're doing it, but now I know the science behind it. Like it works. And the more you do it, and I think trying to give people the space or possibly do it not necessarily all in joint. Like I'm still a proponent of doing joint, but using the caucus in ways to focus on some of this stuff. Because if you do it in joint, you're gonna, depending on what the trust levels are, right? You have to you can't just use a one size fits all, right? Those are right. You know, well, right. You have to figure out the nuances. And sometimes, like I deal with employment, right? If you're dealing with people that are trying to work together again, versus if they're we're never going to see each other again, the approach is going to be very different, right? Because if they can't get through a mediation together, chances are they can't work together, right? Right. Right. No, I get it. I've always been a proponent, Lynn, of they're the same, right? Because I think it was but Freud, I think it was Freud who said, right, you have your love of family and your love of work, right? I mean, they're your, and if any of those are out of sorts, then human beings tend to be out of sorts, right? Right. Right. And I think a facilitated conversation, right? Well, and that often is why, and just trying to cut to the chase or giving people, well, what is it? What did her slide show at the end, right? You have to go slow to go fast sometimes, right? And sometimes people just want to go fast, and then you got to go back to square one. That's what I need to start doing. Lynn, you're just, there we go. As my 14-year-old ran off in a huff this morning. There we go. Right. Avoid the power struggles. Note to self. Avoid, right.
Christina, can you hear me?
Yes, hi.
Do you think is there a possibility to send a short message to the breakout rooms that we have 2 minutes left or so?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. I'm broadcasting it now.
Triple tap. Go great.
You know what's interesting? I've never had this happen in Zoom, even though
2 minutes, yeah.
Lorna isn't actually in our room. I can hear only her speaking in whatever breakout room she's in. And they've been having some good insights. They've really liked it. So that's good.
Yeah, I'm curious to hear the other insight.
They said it was very helpful to see the science behind things they've already been doing and didn't really know why it was working, and now can have that understanding. So,
and I think you most likely know why it's working, but there's no evidence for it, right?
yeah.
It's more experience, and yeah, it's funny, everyone triple tasking with the little ones. And
I know. That's why I don't have my camera on, is because my children are just running around. I don't get I can't go shut a door somewhere.
My 4-year-old is watching a film.
Oh yeah, I have a 4-year-old son too, so
yeah, he gets a lot of television these days. Yeah.
Okay, I went ahead and hit the close rooms because it gives everybody a minute to to end. So that should put us right at that 2-minute point.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Christy.
Yeah, no, thank you. This has been great. I think everyone's really enjoyed it. So
I'm glad you liked it.
do you get to wind down for the evening now after this?
We all got out fast.
Yeah, group 1 reported back.
Good to actually see some faces.
Hello.
Yeah. So welcome back. I'd really be curious to hear about what came up for you in your respective groups, and whoever would like to share first. Maybe let's just do it in a popcorn way. I think we're not too many people, so that might be possible. You can just unmute yourself and start speaking. If it gets too crowded, we can do it with raised hands, but I think now it might.
Okay. There were only 2 people in our chat room, and we talked about it not working every time, and that could be really frustrating. We had the example of neighbors, and then we had the example of divorced people, that unless they're willing to hear you or to hear the other person, it is kind of hard to move them off the dime. Even if you start out talking with them and talking about the future and what they see and that kind of thing.
A specific thing that I was thinking about, in specific to the idea of how I think the getting people to think about the future even for 1 minute can sort of put them in a better mindset, perhaps. I think broadly speaking, is incorporating that into, whether you call it early caucus or conversations with the parties pre-mediation, incorporating something like that, having them think, picture, somewhat specifically what they think, their life might be like ideally a year from now or something like that, to try to create that sort of effect. That was one like kind of concrete thing I considered. Then I had a question for you, if it's all right. The impact of all of these things, whether it be the compassion training or all the other things you referenced, is there any indication of like the impact, like if I did the training today versus if I did the training 6 months from now? Does it wane over time? Does the effect dissipate?
And that's something we don't understand sufficiently yet. So I'm right now in the middle of doing a very long study with a very long follow-up, where we trained people for 1.5 years in meditation, and we measure. Actually, we wanted to measure it right now. We had to stop because of COVID, but we wanted to measure how it looks like 2 years later. Now, because of the pandemic, we'll probably measure how it looks rather 3 years later. But this is something that's understudied, because it's always, in the beginning, we always first want to know whether an intervention works or not in the first place. And once there is sufficient evidence, the next step is then to look at how sustainable these effects are. And we don't know much about it. So we did another clinical study, actually, in a different domain. But there we showed a reduction in anxiety through meditation. And this reduction in anxiety was sustained 4 months after the end of the training. So the training was 2 months, and this reduction in anxiety, which was, because it was a study on aging and Alzheimer's disease, it was the primary outcome. But we could see that anxiety was still reduced in that group 4 months after the end of the training. But in how far that applies to conflict and conflict resolution, we have no clue yet, nothing. So we are really, in many domains, we're really at the beginning of trying to understand the impact of interventions, how long they last, under which conditions. It's really, to me, it's like a moon that we still have to explore, uncover, map, and understand.
Thanks.
Yeah, Lorna.
Excellent presentation, so thank you. I had a question actually regarding meditation. You talked about mindfulness, but what is there a difference, like if somebody does transcendental meditation or the more transcending? Do you know any differences, or kind of all meditation can be helpful?
For conflict resolution, we don't know yet. So for conflict resolution, there is now the evidence that I presented. Mindfulness can be beneficial, compassion can be beneficial, but we are just starting to explore it. And we know in general that different forms of meditation impact different things. So more emotional meditations impact more emotional stuff, and more cognitive meditations impact more cognitive stuff. I'm just being very simplistic here, but even there, we don't have a lot of data yet. So for transcendental meditation, I'm not aware of any study looking at the impact of that type of meditation on conflict resolution.
I'm just curious, because what I've heard is, right, that can cause you to go deeper and more, maybe the self-awareness self, where mindfulness can be more in your head. And I don't know if it can be more heart connecting. I'm just
hard
curious.
Hard to say. I mean, I've been meditating myself for many, many years. And just from personal experience and what my teachers are teaching me, it seems that if you do it long enough, it doesn't matter which school.
What kind? Any kind is good. I mean, right. I mean, it's better to do
that's
something.
What their experience
Right.
suggests, and that's what my experience confirms, but that's a first person perspective. And I'm sure that if I do more emotion meditation, of course, my emotions may change more quickly. But these are studies that have been done in the short term and not with people who've been meditating for long stretches of time.
Right.
So,
thank you. That's all fascinating.
Territory. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. I think Jill, you had a question. Yeah.
Yeah, and we also talked in the mediation realm that the forward-looking idea certainly would be something you could apply, but we wondered what compassion training involved, and is there any way for that sort of thing to work in a very short mediation of a couple hours?
So there are different ways of doing it, and I'm sure many of you know Kenneth Cloak, but there are mediators who meditate themselves, right? And he always recommends to meditate, to have a meditation practice as a mediator, because you bring in these feelings implicitly, and you can then work with that kind of field that you create. And it gets easier to absorb maybe also negative emotions coming from the parties, and to transform them and to create this feeling of safety in general. In terms of whether it can be applied in a really short meditation setting, I think it's difficult, because compassion meditation has a lot to do with motivation, as you saw in that study with the political orientations. Even just asking people to engage in empathy can be sometimes harmful, because some people actually may then experience everything going downwards, being more competitive, right? So I think one thing that can be done, if the situation permits, and if parties are in principle open to doing exercises like that, is trying to see the good part or the goodness of the other, doing exercises like that. So what's actually the strength of the other person, doing things more generic and implicit like that, and linking it to the question, right? So for the question we have here, where do you think the other person the other group could contribute with their strengths, right? And I would more suffuse these things implicitly, especially if it's a high conflict situation, because it may be counterproductive. But of course, if you have parties who are up to try, really motivated to trying everything, and who are really, you feel they're open, you could suggest to them to engage in a meditative practice of cultivating compassion for the other. But I'd be careful with that one. Lynn.
You know, my thought about that might be counterintuitive, but I would think that the mediator can make sure that they're actually helping that person have more self-compassion, so that they feel safer, rather than try to push them toward empathy, which sounds like it has a negative effect, which that's not counterintuitive, right? I also think it's hard, depending on what people's background are, or their training or their experience, for them to allow themselves as mediators to stay with one person and to summarize and to do all the things you could do that would acknowledge and that would show at least non-judgmental attitudes. And I think that ties into self-compassion in the moment,
Yeah, yeah,
rather than trying to move it forward, as Lorna
yeah,
was saying,
yeah.
don't push so hard to move forward.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's an excellent point, to really invite the parties, whoever they are, groups or individuals, to look after their own needs, to take care of themselves, and to wish them well in that endeavor. Yeah, yeah.
And to tell them it's okay for them to be looking out for themselves during the conversation, that that's okay. We want them to.
And in their everyday lives, maybe also.
Right.
Mhm. More things to share from the breakout, or more questions. I think there were quite some vivid discussions, at least we were some of that. So maybe if you would like to share with the others, that might be inspiring them.
Well, I think building on what Lynn said, we were in the same group. I think, you know, it seems to me as I think through all of what you're saying, if you do focus on that self-compassion and give the person sort of the space to feel that way, you could decrease the stress level of that person, where they're going to engage more of a good thinking, as opposed to operating from a place of fear. And to the extent you can just de-stress everyone, right? And do it in different ways. It's a lot of what we talk about as a mediator, right? And you've given us the science to support a lot of things that we've been hearing about for years, but now this is more evidence as to why that really does work if you peel the onion. That was my takeaway.
That's right.
So I have a question that's a little, no one else has it. Are you aware of any research on how relationships with animals might, I mean, Jerry, I know you used to bring your dog in. I don't know if you still do, but I always thought that was fantastic. And people's responses to animals can, you know, calm them down or center them. I also think animals are sort of a symbol of non-judgmental presence. I'm wondering if you're aware of any research. I know of one, medical students and horses, but I'm wondering if that dovetails with this. And
I know there is research, but I couldn't name it to you. I know there are people working with animals, and especially with horses, but also with other animals. But I didn't read any of these papers, but like you, I find it an interesting field. Yeah.
You know, that's a really interesting point, because I've noticed when I'm doing my Zoom mediations and I have everyone in joint, with everyone being home, it actually, you know, I often will maybe make a joke about, you know, confidential, like kids or, you know, furry creatures, we don't need to worry about them. And now I'm thinking, you know, it creates another bond for people that has nothing to do on both sides, right? So it breaks the ice, and it also creates something else. As long as one side doesn't have a cat and the other side doesn't have a dog. No, I'm kidding, but you know what I mean.
right. But even they could coexist in a Zoom meeting and not hurt each other.
Well, right. No, it's fascinating that you say that. Another dimension.
Another dimension.
Let me do an experiment and
Oh, good. Dogs or cats. Oh, yay.
See if that doesn't humanize me a little.
Yes, I think it does.
Well, if there aren't any questions, we'll let everybody go. I know it's getting lunchtime for us and late, really into dinner for Olga. So thank you again so much for joining us and sharing the fascinating information that you've done in your research. Just thank you.
Thank you for being
Thank you.
so
present.
much.
Thank
Enjoy your lunches and maybe see you again one day.
Yep, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
For your dinner. Thank you.
Thank you. This was awesome.